The stale, recirculated air hung heavy in the Vantage Core Solutions war room, thick with the metallic tang of fear. Elliot Trammell, CEO and the man whose dreams were currently melting down faster than a server rack on fire, gripped the edge of the conference table, knuckles bone-white. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, each thud a morbid countdown. The room, usually humming with the quiet efficiency of progress, was now a cacophony of panicked shouts and frantic keyboard clicks. Around him, faces reflected the ghastly glow of dead monitors, their expressions mirroring his own desperate disbelief. "Tell me this isn't real," he thought, the words a choked whisper in the desolate landscape of his mind. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after years of relentless work. Not when the culmination of his life's ambition was dangling precariously on the edge of a $40 million precipice. Shira Collins, VP of Engineering, a woman whose composure was normally as solid as the code she wrote, paced the length of the room like a caged panther. Her fingers flew across her own unresponsive keyboard, a desperate attempt to wrest control from the encroaching darkness. Each failed command echoed the chilling reality. They were losing. Badly. Something tunneled in and collapsed the entire file structure, she announced, her voice strained, tight with a tension that spoke of more than just technical malfunction. Root-level compromise, she thought grimly. This wasn't some random script kiddie playing around. This was calculated, deliberate, malicious. The implications coiled in her stomach like a venomous snake, squeezing the breath from her lungs. This wasn't just a system failure. It was an attack. Alex, the company's cybersecurity specialist, a gaunt figure hunched over a separate console, finally looked up, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and a dawning horror. His voice, usually sharp and analytical, held a tremor of unease. "I think this was triggered internally," he said, the words hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. He scrubbed a hand over his unshaven face, leaving a pale streak against the grime. Days without proper sleep, fueled by caffeine and the relentless pursuit of digital ghosts, had left him perpetually on edge, but this was different. This was a violation. Someone or something in the building might have planted the command sequence, he thought, the idea taking root in the fertile ground of his paranoia. He'd always known the system was vulnerable, a delicate ecosystem susceptible to internal threats. He'd warned them. But no one ever listened until the digital forest was already ablaze. Elliot's initial shock began to curdle into a cold, acidic fear. He could feel the weight of expectation, the pressure of the impending investor meeting, crushing him. $40 million. Years of sleepless nights, countless sacrifices, all hanging by a thread. A digital thread severed by an invisible hand. He looked around the room, at the faces etched with panic, the flickering screens reflecting their collective failure. This is it, he thought, the despair a bitter taste on his tongue. This is the end. Shira stopped her restless pacing, her gaze settling on Alex. "Internal," she repeated, the single word laced with disbelief. But who? Why? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. She knew her team. They were dedicated, brilliant. Could one of them have betrayed them? The thought was unsettling, a crack in the foundation of her carefully constructed world. Alex nodded, the movement stiff and jerky. The point of origin, it traces back to one of the internal terminals. The command sequence wasn't remote. It was executed locally. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the desperate hope that he was wrong. But the data didn't lie. The truth, cold and hard, stared back at him from the screen. "But the security protocols," Shira started, her voice laced with confusion. "Bypassed." Alex cut her off, his voice flat. Someone with high-level access, he thought. Someone who knew the system inside and out. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just sabotage, it was a betrayal. Elliot's fear morphed into a cold, calculating rage. "Find out who," he commanded, his voice raw with suppressed fury. "Find out who did this." And, I swear, he didn't finish the sentence, the threat hanging heavy in the silence. He didn't need to. The unspoken consequences were clear. Ruination, He thought the word a dark promise, utter and complete ruination. The tension in the war room crackled like static electricity. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second a hammer blow against their dwindling hopes. The $40 million, the future of Vantage Core Solutions, all slipping away into the digital abyss. The air, already thick with fear, now held a new element: suspicion. Each person in the room became a potential culprit, their every movement scrutinized, their every expression analyzed. The invisible saboteur lurked among them, a ghost in the machine, and the hunt had begun. The hum of the vending machine, a low, persistent thrum, vibrated through the cheap linoleum floor of the break room. Zahara barely registered it. Her fingers, small but nimble, danced across the surface of her battered tablet. The faint tap-tap-tap, a counterpoint to the rhythmic drone. The lukewarm air, thick with the cloying sweetness of spilled coffee and artificial creamer, clung to her like a damp shroud. She tugged at the collar of her oversized t-shirt, a hand-me-down from her older brother, the faded graphic of a roaring dinosaur, a silent testament to battles long past. Her father, Carl, was busy emptying overflowing trash bins, his movements weary but methodical. He glanced at her occasionally, a flicker of concern in his eyes, but he didn't interrupt. He knew better than to disturb her when she wore that particular furrow in her brow, a tiny crease between her eyebrows that spoke volumes about the intensity of her concentration. Around them, the break room pulsed with a different kind of energy. Snippets of frantic conversations, punctuated by exasperated sighs and the clatter of dropped mugs, drifted in from the hallway. A high-pitched, almost hysterical laugh grated against Zahara's ears, a jarring counterpoint to the intricate lines of code scrolling across her tablet screen. Underscore, they sound like startled pigeons. Underscore, she thought, a wry amusement tugging at the corner of her lips. Underscore, flitting around, making a lot of noise, but not really accomplishing anything. Underscore, the code, however, was a different story. It spoke to her in a language far more elegant and logical than the panicked babble outside. Each line, each symbol, was a piece of a complex puzzle, and she, Zahara Rodas, 12 years old and armed with a second-hand tablet, was the only one who seemed to grasp the bigger picture. She scrolled through the log files, her eyes scanning for anomalies, the faint glow of the screen reflecting in her dark, intense eyes. The air in the break room, already heavy, seemed to thicken with a palpable tension, a silent pressure that mirrored the growing knot in her stomach. Something wasn't right. It was more than just a simple server overload. It was deliberate. A sudden, sharp intake of breath escaped her lips, a soft hiss that went unnoticed amidst the rising cacophony from the hallway. Her fingers stilled on the screen, hovering over a particularly convoluted section of code. Underscore, there it is, underscore, she thought, a thrill of adrenaline chasing away the lingering apathy. Underscore, the recursive call, hidden in plain sight, like a venomous snake coiled amongst harmless vines. Underscore, the elegance of the sabotage was almost admirable. Almost. But admiration quickly gave way to a flicker of annoyance. It was sloppy. Predictable. Anyone with a basic understanding of system architecture could have seen it coming. Underscore, except them, apparently. Underscore, she thought, a hint of disdain coloring her thoughts. Underscore, a multi-million-dollar company brought to its knees by a single line of rogue code. How pathetic. Underscore, through her earbuds, a calm, measured voice broke through her concentration. To override root access, you need to isolate the server object and restructure the pathing permissions manually. It was a recording of a cybersecurity lecture she'd downloaded weeks ago, a voice that had become a familiar companion during her late-night coding sessions. She'd listened to it so many times, she could practically recite it verbatim. But tonight, the words held a new weight, a practical application that sent a shiver of excitement down her spine. This wasn't just theory anymore. This was real. She closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the intricate network architecture, the flow of data, the vulnerable points. It was like a vast, interconnected web, shimmering in the darkness of her mind. She could see the rogue code, a pulsating red anomaly, disrupting the flow, choking the system. The solution, however, wasn't as simple as just deleting the offending line. That would be like treating a symptom, not the disease. The system was compromised, its integrity violated. A complete overhaul was necessary. A daunting task, even for seasoned professionals. Zahara, however, wasn't intimidated. She felt a strange calm settle over her, a sense of purpose that pushed aside the lingering traces of teenage indifference. This wasn't just a challenge, it was an opportunity, a chance to prove herself, not to them, not to the panicked executives whose voices echoed in the hallway, but to herself. To validate the countless hours she'd spent hunched over her tablet, the nights she'd traded sleep for the intoxicating thrill of solving complex algorithms. She opened her eyes, the faint glow of the screen illuminating her face, highlighting the sharp intelligence in her gaze. Her fingers moved again, faster now, more purposeful, as she began to type, the tap-tap-tap of her keyboard a quiet symphony of defiance against the rising tide of chaos just beyond the break-room door. Each keystroke was a calculated move, a strategic maneuver in a silent battle against a hidden enemy. The hum of the vending machine faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic click of keys, a steady beat that resonated with the quiet confidence growing within her. Underscore let them panic. Underscore she thought, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Underscore I'll fix this. Underscore. The stale air of the war room hung heavy, thick with the metallic tang of fear and desperation. Fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune, a counterpoint to the frantic tapping of keyboards and the hushed, urgent whispers. Elliot Trammell, CEO of Vantage Core Solutions, felt the knot in his stomach tighten with every passing second. His meticulously crafted presentation, the culmination of months of relentless work, lay useless on the table, overshadowed by the looming disaster reflected in the faces of his team. $40 million hung in the balance, dangling precariously over the abyss of a catastrophic system crash. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous tic he hadn't been able to shake since the servers went dark a few hours ago. It was all over. The thought echoed in the hollow chambers of his mind, a chilling premonition of failure. He glanced at the digital clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against his dwindling hope. Then, a hesitant knock on the door. Carl Rodas, the night janitor, shuffled in, his eyes mirroring the same anxiety that plagued the room. He held the hand of his daughter, Zahara, a small figure swallowed by the oversized hoodie she wore. Elliot recognized the girl. He often saw her patiently waiting for her father in the lobby, lost in the world of a thick, worn book. He'd never spoken to her, barely registered her presence beyond a cursory nod. Now, her presence felt strangely out of place, a discordant note in the symphony of their crisis. What could this man possibly want? Did he not realize the gravity of the situation? Elliot thought, his irritation momentarily eclipsing his fear. Mr. Trammell, Carl began, his voice barely above a whisper. Zahara, she says she thinks she knows what's wrong with your system. A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the room. Even in the midst of disaster, the absurdity of the situation couldn't be ignored. A 12-year-old girl? Solving a problem that had stumped their team of seasoned engineers? Elliot felt a flicker of annoyance. This was a waste of precious time. He needed solutions, not distractions. I appreciate the thought, Carl, Elliot said, forcing a strained smile, but I think we have it covered. Covered? We're drowning, and he thinks we have it covered, he thought bitterly. Shira Collins, the VP of Engineering, stepped forward, her brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and skepticism. Carl, with all due respect, this isn't the time for, but Zahara, who had remained silent until now, spoke up, her voice clear and surprisingly steady. It's a recursive call issue, she said, her gaze fixed on the complex diagrams displayed on the main screen. The authentication module keeps calling itself, overflowing the stack. She pointed a small finger at a specific section of the code, visible even from across the room. The problem started around line 478 in the validate user function. Silence descended upon the war room, heavy and profound. The nervous chatter ceased. The tapping of keyboards stopped. All eyes turned toward Zahara, a mixture of disbelief and burgeoning curiosity swirling within them. Elliot felt a strange tingling sensation crawl up his spine. Could it be? Could this young girl, barely a teenager, hold the key to their salvation? Shira, her initial skepticism replaced by a dawning realization, turned to Elliot, her voice barely audible. "Wait," she breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and wonder. Did she really say that? Internally, a whirlwind of thoughts raced through her mind. Recursive call issue. Line 478. Validate user function. These were terms that only a seasoned programmer would understand, let alone identify as the root cause of such a complex system failure. Impossible, a voice inside her whispered. She's just a child. Yet a nagging feeling, a flicker of professional instinct, told her that Zahara might be onto something. Alex, their cybersecurity expert, usually a bastion of calm amidst chaos, blinked owlishly from behind his thick-rimmed glasses, his sleep-deprived mind struggling to process the information. He had been working tirelessly for hours, combing through logs, searching for any sign of external intrusion, convinced that sabotage was at play. He had initially dismissed the possibility of a simple coding error. The system was too robust, too meticulously tested. But Zahara's words, precise and targeted, sparked a new line of inquiry in his mind. Recursive call line 478. He pulled up the code on his own workstation, his fingers flying across the keyboard, navigating to the specific function Zahara had identified. The more he looked, the more her analysis made sense. A wave of exhaustion mixed with a strange sense of awe washed over him. The child saw what I missed. Elliot stared at Zahara, his initial disbelief morphing into a stunned silence. The girl's calm demeanor, the unwavering confidence in her voice, sent a jolt of unexpected hope coursing through him. Could this be real? Could this young girl, this unlikely savior, pull them back from the brink? He felt a shift within him, a subtle yet profound change in perspective. The crushing weight of fear that had been suffocating him began to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of awe, a burgeoning flicker of cautious optimism. He took a deep breath, the first truly unhindered breath he had taken in hours. "Shira," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. "Alex, check it out. See if she's right." As Shira and Alex hunched over their workstations, their fingers dancing across the keyboards, the atmosphere in the war room shifted once again. The heavy air of despair began to dissipate, replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation. A 12-year-old girl, an unexpected variable in the equation of their crisis, had introduced a new possibility, a glimmer of hope in the face of imminent failure. The clock on the wall continued its relentless march, but its ticking no longer sounded like a death knell. Now it sounded like a countdown, a prelude to something extraordinary. The air in the war room crackled with a desperate energy, a volatile mix of exhaustion and panic. Elliot Trammell, CEO of Vantage Core Solutions, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The room, usually a hive of controlled activity, now buzzed with chaotic whispers. He glanced at the digital clock, each tick a hammer blow against his dwindling hope. The investment presentation, a potential lifeline for his company, was just hours away, and their entire system remained stubbornly offline. His carefully constructed future felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He could practically taste the bitterness of failure. $40 million gone. The thought echoed in his mind, a morbid mantra. Shira Collins, VP of Engineering, stood rigidly by the main server display, her face illuminated by the ominous red glow of error messages. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of frantic commands, but the system remained unresponsive. Frustration gnawed at her, a familiar companion in the face of complex technical challenges. She prided herself on her ability to dissect and solve any problem, but this one felt different. Malicious. A faint tremor of unease ran down her spine. This wasn't simple incompetence. Alex, the company's cybersecurity lead, hunched over a separate console, his eyes bloodshot from another all-nighter. He muttered to himself, a string of technical jargon punctuated by weary sighs. He'd been suspicious from the start. The nature of the crash, the timing, it all pointed to something more sinister than a random system failure. Sabotage. The word hung heavy in the air, unspoken but palpable. He felt a strange mix of dread and grim satisfaction. Dread at the potential damage, satisfaction at the prospect of a worthy opponent. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the faint scent of stale coffee clinging to his fingers. The door hissed open, admitting Carl Rodas, the night janitor, his face etched with a mixture of apprehension and apology. He held the hand of a small girl, her dark eyes wide with curiosity. This was Zahara, his daughter. Elliot's gaze flickered towards them, a wave of irritation washing over him. This is not the time, Carl. He opened his mouth to speak, to dismiss them both, but Shira cut him off, her voice sharp with urgency. Carl, what is the meaning of this? Carl hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously between his daughter and the tense faces of the executives. She said she knows what's wrong. His voice was barely a whisper, laced with a strange blend of hope and embarrassment. Zahara stepped forward, her small frame radiating an unexpected calmness. The chaos of the room seemed to wash around her, leaving her untouched. Her gaze, sharp and intelligent, fixed on the glowing red error messages on the main display. For a long moment, she simply observed, her silence amplifying the tension in the room. Then, her small voice, clear and precise, cut through the oppressive silence. It's the server restart sequence. There's a recursive call loop. The words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. Elliot stared at her, a flicker of incredulity crossing his face. A 12-year-old? Solving a problem that had stumped his entire team of highly paid engineers? It was absurd. Impossible. Shira, however, felt a spark of something akin to hope ignite within her. The girl's words, though simple, resonated with a strange familiarity. A faint memory of a similar issue she'd encountered years ago. Alex straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he processed Zahara's words. He typed a rapid series of commands into his console, the keys clicking a staccato rhythm against the backdrop of hushed whispers. His initial skepticism gradually gave way to a grudging admiration. The girl's diagnosis, though improbable, aligned with his own suspicions. He felt a thrill of excitement, a hunter finally catching a glimpse of his prey. She's right, Alex announced, his voice hoarse with exhaustion but laced with a newfound energy. There's a recursive call loop inside the server restart sequence. It's designed to trigger a cascade failure. He glanced at Zahara, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and respect. How did you? He trailed off, the question hanging unanswered in the air. Zahara shrugged, her expression unreadable. I saw it. Alex's fingers danced across the keyboard, a blur of motion as he implemented a workaround. The tension in the room thickened, every breath held captive as they watched the main display. The red error messages flickered, then slowly began to fade, replaced by lines of green code scrolling across the screen. The hum of the servers stabilized, a low, steady thrum that filled the silence. The system was back online. A collective exhale swept through the room, the tension finally breaking. Elliot felt a wave of relief wash over him, so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He looked at Zahara, his eyes filled with a newfound awe. This small, unassuming girl had just saved his company. Shira felt a surge of professional pride, mixed with a healthy dose of humility. She'd been so focused on the immediate problem, she'd overlooked the underlying cause. The girl's fresh perspective had cut through the complexity, revealing the elegant simplicity of the solution. Alex, his mind already racing ahead, began analyzing the code, tracing the recursive loop back to its source. He felt a grim satisfaction. He was going to find the person responsible for this. He owed that to the girl, and to the company he'd sworn to protect. The silence was broken by Carl, his voice thick with emotion. "Zahara," he whispered, his eyes shining with pride. Zahara, however, remained unfazed, her expression calm and collected. She simply nodded, her gaze still fixed on the now stable system display. She had seen the problem, and she had fixed it. For her, it was that simple. But for everyone else in the room, the implications were profound. The restoration of the system was more than just a technical victory. It was a shift in the balance of power, a subtle but significant change in the dynamics of Vantage Core Solutions. The events of that afternoon had exposed a vulnerability, but they had also revealed a hidden strength, a silent guardian in the form of a 12-year-old girl. The stale air of the war room, thick with the lingering scent of burnt coffee and desperation, began to clear. A fragile quiet descended, punctuated only by the hum of the servers returning to life. The green glow of restored systems reflected in Elliot's wide, disbelieving eyes. The knot in his stomach, a constant companion for the past agonizing hours, began to loosen. Relief, raw and overwhelming, threatened to break him. He wasn't sure if he wanted to laugh or cry, maybe both. Just moments ago, he'd envisioned the ruin of everything he'd worked for. Vantage Core, his dream, his life's work, teetering on the precipice of oblivion. Now, thanks to a 12-year-old girl, it had been granted a reprieve. He glanced at Zahara, a small figure perched on a chair too large for her, a faint smile playing on her lips. The contrast between her age and the monumental task she had just accomplished was staggering. A prodigy, he thought, the word echoing the awe that resonated within him. Shira Collins, her crisp white shirt now crumpled, ran a hand through her disheveled hair. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins, a sharp contrast to the sudden stillness of the room. Logically, she knew the crisis had been averted, the system stabilized. Yet, a nagging unease lingered at the edge of her awareness. The swiftness, the precision of the initial attack, it was too elegant. Too perfect to be random, her engineer's mind whispered. She turned towards Alex, his face illuminated by the flickering screens, a strange flicker in his usually vacant eyes. He had barely spoken since the system went down, his focus absolute, his fingers a blur across the keyboard. He was a ghost in the machine, his presence barely registered until he uttered a single, chilling word. Again. The room snapped back to life. The nascent relief shattered like thin ice. Elliot felt the blood drain from his face. Not again, he thought, a wave of nausea rising in his throat. It can't be happening again. This time, the fear wasn't just about the company. It was about the insidious, unseen force that threatened to destroy it from within. Shira, her instincts screaming, moved swiftly to Alex's side. Lines of code, cryptic and menacing, scrolled across his screen. She leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't a repeat of the previous attack. This was different, targeted, malicious. The elegance of the first breach was now replaced by a raw, brutal efficiency. "This isn't the same breach," Shira said, her voice tight with a growing horror. "This is a new one." She felt a cold dread creep into her bones, the kind that told her they were dealing with something far more complex, far more sinister than a simple system malfunction. Elliot, his face ashen, stumbled towards them. His gaze, sharp and questioning, darted between Shira and the screen. "Explain," he demanded, his voice barely a whisper. "Explain what's happening." Shira pointed to a specific section of the code, a string of characters that looked innocuous to the untrained eye. This was planted, designed to trigger one failure, then follow it with another. A delayed reaction. She felt her mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle. Who would do this? And why? Alex, his voice raspy from lack of sleep, finally spoke. "A logic bomb," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Triggered by the initial restoration. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. This was coordinated." Elliot breathed, the words heavy with realization. He felt a sickening twist in his gut. Sabotage. The word hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusations. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each member of his team. Trust, The foundation of his company began to crumble around him. One of them, he thought, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. One of them is doing this. The silence that followed was heavier than before, laced with suspicion and fear. Each glance exchanged was now a silent interrogation. Zahara, observing the shift in the room's atmosphere, tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes taking in the adult's reactions. She had sensed the underlying tension from the moment she walked into the room, a quiet hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their professional composure. Now, that tension had amplified, sharpened, like a knife honed to a razor's edge. She felt a strange detachment from the fear that gripped the room, her focus remaining on the logic of the situation. If the first attack was a sophisticated distraction, then what was the purpose of the second? What was the saboteur truly after? Shira, following a hunch, began tracing the source of the new attack. The process was slow, painstaking, like peeling back layers of a carefully constructed lie. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The tension in the room became palpable, a living thing. Then, finally she found it. A single line of code, a digital fingerprint leading back to its creator. She stared at the screen, her breath held captive in her chest. It couldn't be, but it was. Martin Liu, she whispered, the name hanging heavy in the air. The software architect. The man who had been with Vantage Core since its inception. The man Elliot trusted implicitly. Elliot turned sharply, his face a mask of disbelief. Martin, he repeated, his voice hollow. But why? He couldn't comprehend it. Martin had been his friend, his confidant. He'd shared his dreams, his vulnerabilities with him. Betrayal, he thought, the word a bitter taste in his mouth. He felt a cold, hollow ache in his chest, a profound sense of loss that went beyond the immediate crisis. Shira scrolled through the logs, revealing a pattern of subtle manipulations, carefully hidden within the system's architecture. He's been siphoning off company data for months, she explained, her voice tight with anger and disgust. Small amounts, almost undetectable. He was planning to sell it to a competitor. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Martin's recent disengagement, his veiled criticisms of the company's direction, his sudden interest in their competitors' products. It had all been a carefully orchestrated charade. Elliot felt a surge of anger, hot and blinding, replacing the initial shock. He had been played, manipulated by someone he considered friend. The trust he had so freely given had been weaponized against him, against his company. He closed his eyes, trying to regain control, to quell the storm raging within him. This changes everything, he thought, the realization sinking in with chilling clarity. The attack wasn't just a technical problem. It was a betrayal that cut to the very core of Vantage Core. The stale air hung heavy in the war room, thick with the residue of burnt coffee and frayed nerves. Alex, eyes bloodshot, hunched over his console, fingers flying across the keyboard in a frantic ballet. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, reflecting the flickering glow of the monitor. He'd been awake for over 36 hours, fueled by caffeine and a gnawing suspicion that something far more sinister than a simple system failure was at play. His gut churned with a disquiet that resonated deeper than exhaustion. This wasn't random. It was targeted, malicious. He could feel it in the digital bones of the system. Across the room, Shira Collins, her face a mask of controlled intensity, paced like a caged panther. The initial wave of panic had receded, replaced by a grim determination. She'd rebuilt systems from the ground up, wrestled with code that defied logic, and stared down deadlines that threatened to swallow her whole. This, however, felt different. It was like chasing a ghost in the machine, a phantom error that danced just beyond her grasp. Each fleeting moment of progress was met with a fresh wave of setbacks. A cold dread began to creep into her thoughts. What if they couldn't fix it? What if this was the end of Vantage Core? Elliot Trammell, his face ashen, sat at the head of the table, the weight of the impending $40 million investment pitch pressing down on him like a physical burden. His breath hitched in his throat. He'd poured his heart and soul into Vantage Core, sacrificing everything for this moment. Now, with the finish line in sight, it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. Fear, raw and visceral, clawed at him. He glanced at Zahara, the 12-year-old girl who had somehow, miraculously, pulled them back from the brink just hours before. She sat quietly beside her father, Carl, her gaze fixed on the main display, her small fingers drumming lightly on the table. A flicker of hope, fragile and hesitant, ignited within him. Zahara watched the cascading lines of code scroll across the screen, her mind a whirlwind of algorithms and data streams. The second attack, more insidious than the first, was like a virus, burrowing deep into the system, masquerading as legitimate processes. She noticed a peculiar sequence, a repetitive pattern that seemed out of place. A faint memory tugged at the edge of her awareness. She'd seen this before, buried deep within the system architecture, a tool used for diagnostics and maintenance. But why would it be active now? And why was it behaving so erratically? That sequence, she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tense silence of the war room. It's familiar. I think it's piggybacking on a system tool. All eyes turned to her. Shira's initial skepticism softened into cautious curiosity. Alex, despite his exhaustion, felt a jolt of adrenaline. Could this girl, barely a teenager, actually see something they had missed? Elliot leaned forward, his heart pounding. Explain. Zahara, unfazed by the attention, pointed to a specific line of code. This tool, it's designed for internal system adjustments, not for external access. But someone has modified it, using it as a backdoor to inject malicious code. Alex's mind raced. He quickly cross-referenced Zahara's observation with his own analysis. Her intuition was spot on. The system tool, typically dormant, was indeed being manipulated. He could trace the access point, pinpoint the source of the attack. His fingers flew across the keyboard, digging deeper into the system logs, tracing the digital breadcrumbs. The truth, when it finally revealed itself, hit him with the force of a physical blow. Martin Liu, their own software architect. A wave of nausea washed over Alex. He'd worked alongside Martin for years, respected his technical prowess, even considered him a friend. Betrayal, sharp and bitter, filled his mouth. He looked at Zahara, a mixture of awe and gratitude swirling within him. This girl, with her quiet confidence and uncanny ability, had not only saved the company, but had also exposed a traitor in their midst. Shira, her initial disbelief giving way to a cold fury, felt a surge of protectiveness towards Zahara. She knew the cutthroat nature of the tech world, the ruthless ambition that drove some to extreme measures. Martin, blinded by his own insecurities and greed, had risked everything, putting the entire company in jeopardy. Elliot's fear transformed into a stunned silence, then a slow, burning anger. He trusted Martin, given him a position of responsibility, and this was how he repaid that trust. He thought of the countless hours of work, the sacrifices, the dreams that hung in the balance. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then looked at Zahara. The fear was gone, replaced by a newfound resolve. "You are starting now," Elliot said, his voice firm, the tremor of fear replaced by a quiet strength. He looked directly at Zahara, his gaze filled with a profound respect. "I want to offer you a long-term mentorship paid. We'll work around your school schedule, of course. But your insights, your talent, it's extraordinary. We need you here." Carl Rodas, who had been watching the unfolding drama with a mixture of bewilderment and pride, looked at his daughter. He had always known she was special, her quiet brilliance a constant source of wonder. But to see her recognized, valued by these powerful people in this high-pressure environment, it filled him with a sense of profound satisfaction. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent affirmation of his unwavering support. Zahara, her expression unchanged, considered Elliot's offer. The internal gears of her mind whirred, analyzing the possibilities, weighing the implications. She hadn't sought the spotlight, hadn't intended to become the company's savior. She'd simply seen a problem and solved it, driven by an innate curiosity and a love for the elegant logic of code. But now, a new path was opening before her, a path that could lead to untold opportunities. A faint smile played at the corners of her lips. The crisis had passed, the immediate threat neutralized. But the ripple effects of Zahara's actions, her quiet brilliance, would continue to resonate through Vantage Core, reshaping its culture, its future, and the lives of everyone within its walls. The atmosphere in the war room shifted, the tension easing, replaced by a fragile sense of relief, and a shared understanding that something extraordinary had just transpired. The dawn was breaking, not just for Vantage Core, but for Zahara Rodas, the 12-year-old girl who had quietly rewritten the rules of the game. The Dallas skyline, a jagged tapestry of steel and glass, bled into the pale Friday morning sky. Inside the Vantage Core Solutions boardroom, the air hung thick with a tension so palpable it vibrated in Elliot's chest. The remnants of yesterday's near catastrophe still clung to him like a second skin. The cold sweat, the nausea, the sheer terror of seeing his dreams crumble before his eyes. He adjusted his tie, the knot feeling like a noose. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the board members, their faces impassive masks of expectation, their silence a suffocating judgment. He took a deep breath, the stale recycled air doing little to calm the tremors in his hands. Just get through this, Elliot. Just explain. Just survive. As you all know, he began, his voice a strained whisper amplified by the room's acoustics. We experienced a critical system failure just hours before our demonstration to the Angel Oak Capital representatives. He could feel his pulse hammering against his ribs. They already know, Elliot. They were here. They saw the chaos. The thought made his stomach churn. What you don't know, he continued, pushing the words past the lump at his throat, is the full extent of the problem, nor the unconventional way it was resolved. Denise Rowan, the board's steely-eyed chairperson, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Her silence was more potent than any interrogation. Elliot swallowed, the click of his throat echoing in the sudden stillness. They're waiting for blood, Elliot. Yours. He forced himself to meet her gaze. This wasn't just negligence. This was malicious. The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. A low murmur rippled through the room. He could see the surprise, the disbelief etched onto their faces. Good. Let them feel something other than disappointment. Are we absolutely sure? Denise's voice, though quiet, sliced through the room like a honed blade. Yes, Elliot affirmed, his voice gaining strength. He projected the evidence onto the screen. Lines of corrupted code, access logs, deleted files. Each piece of data was a nail in Martin Liu's coffin. He explained how Alex, their cybersecurity lead, had worked tirelessly through the night, tracing the digital fingerprints of the sabotage back to a single source. Alex, that man deserves a medal, a vacation, a lifetime supply of caffeine. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. He was trying to sabotage the demo. Elliot continued, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the board, maybe to force a buyout, or perhaps even a complete collapse. He'd been betting against us in the market. The silence that followed was thick with shock. Elliot could almost taste the bitterness in the air. Betrayal. It's a bitter pill, isn't it? He knew the board would be reeling. Martin Liu, their lead software architect, a man they had trusted, had betrayed them. But, Elliot continued, his voice taking on a new, almost hesitant tone, there's another element to this story, an unexpected one. He glanced towards the door where Shira stood, her face unreadable. Beside her, small and quiet, stood Zahara and her father, Carl. Carl shifted nervously, his hand resting protectively on Zahara's shoulder. Zahara, however, stood still as a statue, her dark eyes observing the room with an unsettling calmness. She's braver than any of us in this room. The thought struck him with unexpected force. He explained Zahara's role, the late-night discovery, her uncanny ability to decipher the corrupted code, her quiet confidence in the face of a crisis that had paralyzed seasoned engineers. He spoke of how she had not only identified the problem, but also provided the solution. Her young mind navigating the complex system with an intuition that bordered on the supernatural. Underscore a 12-year-old girl saved us. A 12-year-old girl saw what we couldn't. Underscore he saw the incredulity on their faces, the barely concealed skepticism. Underscore they don't believe it. They can't. Underscore he understood. It sounded fantastical, unbelievable. But it was true. He looked at Zahara, her face still impassive, a slight flicker of something, perhaps amusement, in her dark eyes. Underscore she knows what they're thinking. She doesn't care. Underscore Denise Rowan cleared her throat, the sound breaking the spell. "In this child," she began, her voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and a hint of something else, perhaps reluctant admiration. She single-handedly restored the system, with some guidance from Shira and Alex. Elliot clarified, acknowledging the crucial role his team had played in implementing Zahara's solutions. He wouldn't diminish their contributions, but he wouldn't diminish Zahara's either. "But yes," he continued, meeting Denise's gaze head-on, "the core solution, the key to unlocking the entire system that came from Zahara." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the stunned silence of shock or disbelief. It was the heavy silence of contemplation, of reassessment. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting, the initial skepticism slowly giving way to something else, something akin to awe. Underscore, they're starting to see it. They're starting to understand. Underscore, he felt a surge of something close to triumph. Not for himself, but for Zahara. He watched as Carl Rodas, Zahara's father, straightened his shoulders, a subtle but profound shift in his posture. His eyes, previously filled with uncertainty, now shone with a quiet pride. Underscore, he sees it too. He finally sees what she's capable of. Underscore, Elliot knew this was more than just a technical victory. It was a human victory, a testament to the power of untapped potential, a reminder that brilliance could be found in the most unexpected places. The air in the boardroom began to shift, the oppressive weight of the near disaster slowly dissipating, replaced by a cautious optimism, a fragile hope. The crisis had exposed not only a saboteur, but also a savior. And in that unlikely pairing, in the stark contrast between betrayal and brilliance, Vantage Core Solutions had found its redemption. The stale scent of leftover pizza and burnt coffee still clung to the air, a ghostly reminder of last Friday's near-apocalypse. Now, a week later, the Vantage Core offices hummed with a different kind of electricity. Not the frantic, panicked energy of a crashing system, but a low thrum of disbelief, tinged with an almost giddy excitement. The story had broken, not just within the confines of Vantage Core, not just whispered among Dallas tech circles, but splashed across national news, tweeted, retweeted, and dissected in countless online forums. 12-year-old coding prodigy saves multi-million-dollar tech company. The headlines screamed it, the articles breathlessly detailed it, and the internet, that insatiable beast, devoured it whole. Elliot Trammell, his tie loosened, a faint tremor still clinging to his hands despite the caffeine coursing through his veins, watched the news coverage from his office. The relief, the sheer, bone-deep relief of having dodged a bullet the size of a meteor, still hadn't fully subsided. He'd gone from the precipice of utter ruin to the dizzying heights of unforeseen success. The $40 million investment was secure, and then some. Venture capitalists were practically throwing money at Vantage Core, clamoring to be a part of the Zahara Rodas miracle. He almost chuckled at the absurdity of it all. His company, his life, saved by a 12-year-old girl who, just a week ago, he wouldn't have recognized if she'd walked right up to him. A prickle of guilt, sharp and unwelcome, pierced his relief. He barely knew the name of his night janitor's daughter. He barely registered the existence of the people who kept his gleaming office tower functional, the invisible hands that allowed him to focus on his million-dollar dreams. Shira Collins, her usual crisp efficiency slightly ruffled by the constant barrage of media requests, stood outside Zahara's makeshift office, the break room, hastily cleared and equipped with a borrowed laptop and a whiteboard covered in equations that made Shira's head spin. She hesitated, her knuckles hovering over the door. This whole situation was surreal. A week ago, she was wrestling with lines of corrupted code, her world shrinking to the flickering screen of her monitor. Now, she was managing a media frenzy surrounding a preteen genius. Shira took a deep breath, smoothing down the wrinkles of her blazer. She had to admire the girl's composure. Zahara, amidst the chaos, remained a quiet island of calm, her focus unwavering. Zahara, she knocked softly, pushing the door open. Inside, Zahara sat hunched over the laptop, her brow furrowed in concentration. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, a language Shira understood but couldn't decipher at this speed. She was rewriting sections of the core algorithm, optimizing, refining, strengthening. Shira felt a pang of something akin to awe. This child, barely tall enough to see over the table, possessed a raw talent that surpassed even the most seasoned engineers on her team. The thought stirred a complex mix of admiration and a strange, unfamiliar unease within her. Zahara looked up, her dark eyes, so serious and intense, meeting Shira's. "Hi, Miss Collins." "Hi, Zahara." The media, they're still clamoring for an interview. Several networks are here. Do you want to speak to them? Shira's voice was hesitant. She knew the pressure this child was under, the sudden, overwhelming spotlight. Zahara blinked, her gaze shifting to the window, where the flashing lights of news vans were visible. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face, a fleeting vulnerability that Shira hadn't seen before. "If I talk to them," Zahara's voice was quiet, almost lost in the hum of the air conditioning. "Will it help someone like me do what I did?" The question caught Shira off guard. It wasn't the calculated response of a media-trained child prodigy. It was a genuine, heartfelt query, laced with a quiet conviction that surprised and touched Shira deeply. "Maybe," Shira answered, her voice softening. "Maybe it might show another girl sitting in a break room somewhere, another kid fascinated by code, that she's allowed to try, that she's capable of amazing things." Zahara considered this, the silence stretching between them. Then a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay." As Zahara faced the cameras, her father, Carl, stood just outside the frame, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. He watched his daughter, this quiet, introverted girl who usually preferred the company of her computer to crowds, speak with an eloquence and poise that belied her age. Pride swelled in his chest, so potent it almost ached. He'd always known Zahara was special, but to see her acknowledged like this, to see the world recognize her brilliance, it was a moment he would never forget. Zahara's story resonated. It wasn't just a tale of technical prowess. It was a story of a young girl, overlooked and underestimated, who stepped up when everyone else faltered. It was a story of potential unlocked, of a hidden talent brought to light. It was a story that sparked a fire in the hearts of countless young people across the globe, whispering the possibility of their own untapped brilliance. And in the sterile corporate world of Vantage Core Solutions, it was the catalyst for a quiet, yet profound shift. Conversations started, perspectives changed. The invisible lines that separated the executives from the support staff, the coders from the cleaners, began to blur. Zahara's story, in its simple, powerful way, had rewritten more than just lines of code. It had rewritten the narrative of Vantage Core itself. And as the sun set on another Friday, casting long shadows across the Dallas skyline, a new chapter began, not just for Zahara Rodis, but for the company she had unwittingly transformed. The hum of servers, once a soundtrack of Elliot Trammell's anxieties, now held a different resonance, a low thrum of potential. Weeks had bled into a blur of hushed meetings, rapid-fire code reviews, and the constant, quiet presence of Zahara Rodis. The office itself felt transformed, less a sterile space of frantic deadlines, and more a collaborative hive. Beanbag chairs littered what was once a pristine white breakout area. Markers scribbled equations and algorithms on the glass walls that had once showcased sleek marketing slogans. The air buzzed, not just with electricity, but with a palpable shift in energy. Elliot watched Zahara, perched on a rolling chair, her small fingers flying across the keyboard. Her brow furrowed in concentration, a tiny wrinkle forming between her dark eyebrows. He remembered the fear that had gripped him those weeks ago, the cold dread of impending failure. Now a hesitant optimism, a fragile bud, was beginning to bloom in his chest. He had staked everything on this venture, on Vantage Core success. Zahara, improbably, had not only saved the company, but was now reshaping it, brick by digital brick. "She's incredible," Shira Collins murmured beside him, her voice laced with a mixture of awe and something akin to reverence. Elliot nodded, the words catching in his throat. Shira, ever the pragmatist, had initially seen Zahara as a solution to a problem. Now, he suspected, she saw something more, a glimpse into a future they hadn't even imagined. He recalled the frantic hours of the system crash, the gnawing suspicion of sabotage, the desperate gamble on a 12-year-old's talent. The risk had paid off 1,000-fold. Alex, his eyes bloodshot but alert, shuffled past, a half-eaten energy bar clutched in his hand. "Her logic is elegant," he mumbled, his voice raspy from lack of sleep, but carrying a note of genuine admiration. "She sees patterns we miss, connects dots we don't even know exist." He glanced back at Zahara, a flicker of something like envy crossing his features. He, the cybersecurity expert, the supposed guardian of the system, had been blind to the insidious code Martin Liu had woven into the core architecture. Zahara, with her quiet focus, had dissected it, exposed it, neutralized it. The memory of Martin, his face contorted in disbelief and anger, still sent a shiver down Elliot's spine. The betrayal had been a bitter pill, but had also served as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities they had ignored. Carl Rodas, Zahara's father, stood near the coffee machine, observing his daughter with a quiet pride that radiated from him like warmth from a hearth. He held a steaming mug in his hands, his calloused fingers wrapped around it like a lifeline. Elliot remembered Carl's initial hesitation, his protectiveness of Zahara, his worry that this world, this high-stakes environment, would be too much for her. But he, too, had witnessed the transformation, not just in Zahara, but in the company itself. The rigid hierarchy, the cutthroat competition, the suffocating pressure, it was all slowly dissolving, replaced by a newfound sense of community, a shared purpose. Zahara, oblivious to the scrutiny, typed another line of code, her fingers moving with a rhythmic precision. The clicking of the keys, once a jarring sound in the hushed office, now felt like a steady heartbeat, a reassuring pulse. She paused, her gaze fixed on the screen, her lips moving silently as she mentally processed the complex algorithms. Elliot wondered what thoughts were swirling behind those dark, intelligent eyes. He had tried to understand her, to decipher the workings of her mind, but she remained an enigma, a quiet force that had reshaped their world. He approached her, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Everything okay, Elliot?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. He felt a pang of guilt, a reminder of the burden they had placed on her young shoulders. "Yes, Zahara," he replied, his voice a little rough. "Just checking in." "The system is stable," she said, her eyes returning to the screen. "But it needs nurturing." The word, so unexpected, hung in the air. Nurturing. Not fixing, not upgrading, not optimizing. Nurturing. It was a perspective that had been missing, a vital element they had overlooked in their relentless pursuit of efficiency and profit. Later, as the day wound down and the office began to empty, Shira lingered, watching Zahara pack her small backpack. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, bathing everything in a warm, golden light. She thought of the weeks that had passed, the subtle but profound changes Zahara's presence had wrought. The engineers, once fiercely competitive, now collaborated freely, sharing ideas and knowledge. The air of suspicion that had lingered after Martin's betrayal was dissipating, replaced by a cautious trust, a tentative sense of unity. She walked towards Zahara, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. "You've done remarkable things, Zahara," she said, her voice filled with a warmth she rarely allowed herself to express. Zahara looked up, her dark eyes meeting Shira's. "I just saw what needed to be done," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Shira shook her head, her smile widening. "You changed more than our system, Zahara," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You changed us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Zahara's small shoulders straightened, a flicker of something like understanding crossing her face. She nodded slowly, then slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked towards her father, leaving Shira standing in the golden light, contemplating the profound impact one young girl had had on their world.